Nobody told you that patience had a limit. Nobody sat you down at the beginning of this and said, your willingness to wait, to understand, to extend grace to someone who keeps showing you the same pattern, that has an expiration date. And past that date, it stops being a virtue and starts being a vehicle. A vehicle for continuing to absorb what should not be absorbed, for staying inside what should have been left, for calling something noble, that is, underneath the nobility, just the fear of accepting what you have been shown. You were told, by the self-help content, by the attachment theory frameworks, by the well-meaning advice of people who understood the psychology but not the cost, that patience was the answer. That if you could just hold steady long enough, create enough safety, be consistent enough in the face of their inconsistency, the wall would eventually come down. That love, expressed with enough sustained gentleness, would reach the frightened person underneath the avoidance, and something would shift. That the waiting was not passive but active, not weakness but strength, not the absence of a boundary but the presence of something deeper, the willingness to see someone's potential and love them toward it. That story is not entirely false, but it is incomplete in a way that has cost you enormously. And the part that is missing, the part nobody included in the patient understanding framework, is what this video is going to cover with the directness the subject deserves. Patience, in the context of an avoidant relationship, operates differently than it operates anywhere else. In most contexts, patience is genuinely valuable. It allows processes to unfold at their natural rate. It creates space for growth that cannot be forced. It demonstrates a quality of love that is not contingent on immediate gratification. These are real virtues, and they produce real results in situations where the thing being waited for is actually in the process of arriving. The critical word is arriving. Patience is a virtue when what is being waited for is in motion, when there is genuine, demonstrable, behaviorally evidenced movement toward the thing the patience is waiting for. When the waiting is not simply the suspension of your own needs in deference to someone else's timeline, but an active, boundaried, time-limited allowance for a process that is genuinely occurring. Patience in the avoidant dynamic is almost never that. It is almost never the bounded, evidence-based waiting of someone who can see real movement and is choosing to allow it the time it needs. It is in most cases the unbounded, evidence-resistant waiting of someone whose hope has become decoupled from the actual data of the situation. Waiting not because the thing is arriving, but because the waiting itself has become the relationship. Because the hope has become more familiar than the possibility of its resolution. Because the patience, however exhausting, is less terrifying than the alternative. The honest acknowledgement that what is being waited for is not coming. Not now. Perhaps not ever. Not without a level of work from the other person that your patience cannot supply and your love cannot motivate. Here is the mechanism that makes patience specifically counterproductive in the avoidant dynamic. And it needs to be understood precisely because it is the thing that transforms a genuine virtue into an inadvertent harm, to you, and in a way that is less obvious, but equally real, to them. The avoidance attachment system requires a specific environmental condition to remain stable. That condition is the reliable availability of someone who will absorb the distance without moving, who will continue to be present and warm and oriented toward the connection, regardless of how the connection is being treated, who will, in effect, demonstrate repeatedly that the cost of the avoidance withdrawal strategy is zero, that the door remains open, that the warmth persists, that the investment on the other side continues unaffected by the management. Your patience provides that condition, perfectly, completely, with an unintentional precision that could not be more effective if it had been designed specifically for that purpose. Every day of patient waiting confirms to the avoidance system that the strategy is working. That distance can be created and maintained without consequence. That the intimacy alarm can be managed by withdrawal, and the withdrawal will be absorbed and nothing fundamental will change. The security of your continued availability is the thing that makes continued distance feel safe. Your patience is, structurally, the permission slip for the pattern to continue. This is not your fault. The patience came from love, from genuine understanding of where the avoidance behavior originates, from the compassion of someone who could see the frightened person underneath the defensive exterior and wanted, with everything in them, to be the safe presence that made the fear unnecessary. That impulse to be someone's safety is one of the most generous things a human being can offer. It is not a mistake in the moral sense, but it is a mistake in the practical sense, because safety, in the context of avoidant attachment, is not what produces change. Safety, paradoxically, is what produces more of the same. The avoidant does not change because they feel safe. They change when they change because the cost of not changing becomes undeniable, because the pattern produces a consequence significant enough to compete with the fear of intimacy, because something is genuinely at stake in a way that their system cannot manage away. Your patience removes the stick. Your consistent availability eliminates the consequence. Your willingness to absorb the distance and continue showing up communicates with perfect clarity that there is no cost to the current behavior. And a behavior without cost is a behavior with no structural motivation to change. This is the scam. Not a deliberate one, not a conspiracy, but a genuine, functional, operationally precise mechanism by which the virtue you were told was the answer is actually the thing maintaining the problem. Your patience is not moving them toward change. It is insulating them from the consequences that might. The counter-argument will arise. It always does. The counter-argument says, but I have seen avoidance change. I have seen the patience eventually rewarded. I have seen the wall come down. And that counter-argument is not wrong. It is describing something real that does occasionally happen, but it is misattributing the cause. When avoidance genuinely change inside a relationship, when the wall actually comes down rather than temporarily lowering in response to the threat of loss, the cause is not the patience of the person waiting. The cause is internal work, sustained, probably professionally supported, genuinely uncomfortable internal work that the avoidant undertook because something in their own life, a reckoning, a loss, a crisis of meaning, a moment of honest self-confrontation, made the cost of not changing more present than the fear of changing. The patience may have created the container in which that work eventually occurred. But the patience did not cause the work. The work caused the change. And the work is something the avoidant has to choose, initiate, and sustain entirely independent of how patient or impatient you are being. Which means the patient partner and the impatient partner have roughly equivalent influence over whether the avoidant does the work. Which means the patience is not buying what you believe it is buying. It is buying the continuation of the current state, your presence, their managed distance, the dynamic intact, but it is not buying the change. The change is not for sale at the price of patience. It is only available at the price of the avoidant's own willingness. And that willingness is not something you can purchase on their behalf, however long you wait. So what does this mean practically? What does someone do with the recognition that the strategy they have been pursuing, the patient, understanding, consistently available presence, is not the path to the outcome they have been waiting for it to produce? It does not mean becoming impatient in the reactive sense. Becoming suddenly demanding, issuing ultimatums, expressing the accumulated frustration of all the waiting in a way that is designed to force a response. That is not the alternative. That is just a different form of being organized around their behavior, still watching, still responding, still allowing the dynamic to determine your actions, still inside the same fundamental orientation, just with a different emotional temperature. The alternative is something more fundamental than a change of strategy. It is a change of orientation. A realization, arrived at honestly, accepted fully, integrated into how you actually move through your days, that the waiting itself is the thing to examine. Not how long to wait, not under what conditions to wait. But whether waiting, the entire posture of suspended self in deference to someone else's timeline, is actually a thing you are choosing, or whether it is a thing that has been happening to you. A default you entered without fully deciding to. A position your hope put you in without your full, conscious, clearly-eyed consent. Because consent matters here. Not in the dramatic sense, but in the quiet, daily, practical sense of whether you have actually chosen this. Whether at any point you sat down with full information and said, I understand what the evidence is showing me, I understand what patience has and has not produced, I understand the mechanism by which my continued availability is functioning in this dynamic. And I am choosing to continue, consciously, with open eyes, with a clear assessment of what I am accepting and what I am releasing in the choosing. Most people in this position have not made that choice. They have drifted into the waiting the way you drift into any habitual state, gradually, incrementally, through a series of small decisions, each of which seemed reasonable in the moment, and none of which, individually, constituted the full commitment to indefinite suspension of your own needs that the accumulated position represents. Each extension of patience felt justified by the most recent piece of evidence, the warm moment, the genuine vulnerability, the almost commitment that suggested the waiting was almost over. And the almost kept receding and the patience kept extending And at no point did anyone ask, directly and without softening, is this what you are choosing? Are you choosing this? Not rhetorically, as an actual question that deserves an actual answer from the part of you that is clearest, rather than the part of you that is most invested in a particular outcome. Are you choosing the waiting with full knowledge of what the waiting is and is not producing? Are you choosing the continued availability with honest acknowledgement of what that availability is providing to the dynamic and what it is costing you? Are you choosing the patience with clear eyes about the mechanism by which the patient is functioning, not as a force for change, but as the condition that makes the absence of change sustainable? If the answer is yes, if you can say honestly and clearly that you understand all of this and you're choosing to continue, then continue. A conscious choice made with full information is a legitimate choice even when it is costly. People choose difficult things for real reasons. Love is a real reason. The genuine potential you see in someone is a real reason. The history you share and the moments that were genuinely extraordinary and the version of the relationship that exists in the best of what you have experienced together, those are real. And if you can hold all of that alongside the full clarity of what the dynamic actually is and what your patience actually produces, and still choose to stay inside it for a defined, honest, self-respecting period, that is your choice to make. But it has to be a choice. Not a drift, not a default, not the continuation of a posture you entered without full awareness and have not examined since. A genuine, conscious, fully informed choice made by the version of you that sees clearly rather than the version that is organized around the hope. And if the answer is no, if the honest answer is that you have not been choosing this, but rather inhabiting it, that the patience has been happening to you rather than being actively selected by you, that the waiting has become so habitual that it stopped feeling like a posture and started feeling like simply how things are, then something needs to change. Not dramatically. Not in the form of a confrontation or an ultimatum or the sudden withdrawal of everything you have been providing, but in the form of a genuine internal shift, a reclamation of your own agency in the situation, a return to the position of someone who is making choices rather than absorbing circumstances. That reclamation begins with the recognition that your time is finite, not as a guilt-producing fact, but as a grounding one. You have a specific, limited, irreplaceable amount of time in this life, and the way that time is spent, what it is oriented toward, what it is given to, what it is organized around, that is the actual content of your life, not in the philosophical abstract, in the practical, daily, lived sense. Every day the waiting continues is a day that belonged to your life and was given to the suspension of it, to the management of hope rather than the inhabitation of the present, to the project of someone else's potential becoming rather than your own actual becoming. That is a real cost, not a metaphor. Not an abstraction, a real, daily, accumulating cost paid in the only currency that cannot be replenished. There is a particular psychological trap that the patient's narrative sets up that needs to be named directly because it is one of the most effective mechanisms for keeping people inside dynamics past the point of any reasonable return. The trap is this: the longer you have been patient, the more the patience itself becomes a sunk cost that feels like justification for continued patience. The investment of time and emotional energy and sustained presence begins to function as an argument for staying, not because the situation has improved or the evidence has changed, but because leaving would mean that the investment was wasted, that all the waiting produced nothing, that the cost was paid without return. The sunk cost fallacy. You know this intellectually. Most people in this situation do, and knowing it intellectually does almost nothing to neutralize its emotional force. Because the emotional experience of having invested significantly in something is not neutralized by the intellectual knowledge that past investment is not a rational basis for future commitment. The heart does not care about rational basis. The heart experiences the accumulated investment as a weight that pulls toward continuation rather than release, as a reason to stay that feels from the inside like loyalty or perseverance, or the refusal to give up on something real. It is none of those things. It is the sunk cost doing what sunk costs do, distorting the evaluation of the present by loading it with the weight of the past. The question is never how much have I already invested. The question is always what is the present situation actually offering, and does that justify continued investment going forward? Those are completely different questions. And the second one, answered honestly without the distorting weight of the first, often produces a different answer than the one the accumulated investment seems to demand. Answer it now, without the sunk cost, without the weight of how long you have been waiting, or how much you have already given, or how significant the investment has been. Just the present situation. What is it actually offering? Not in its best moments, in its average ones. Not in the most recent warm interaction, in the consistent, ordinary, reliable texture of how this connection functions on a normal day. What is the present, ongoing, demonstrated reality of what this dynamic provides, and what it costs, and whether those two things are in any reasonable proportion to each other? That assessment, made cleanly and without the distortion of the sunk cost, is the foundation of the conscious choice. It is the information the choice needs to be genuinely informed rather than hope-informed, and it is available to you, right now, in the clarity that has been building throughout this conversation. In the specific, detailed, embodied knowledge of your own experience that you have been developing the courage to trust. Let's talk about what happens on the other side of the patient's ending. Because one of the things that keeps people inside the patient posture longer than it serves them is the fear of what the ending of it produces. The fear of loss, obviously, but underneath that, the fear of something more specific. The fear of having been wrong to stay, of having wasted the time, of the grief being disproportionate to the outcome, of moving forward without the resolution that the patience was supposed to eventually provide. There is no clean resolution. That needs to be said directly. The ending of patience in an avoidant dynamic does not typically produce the satisfying conclusion where everything is acknowledged and the cost is recognized and the goodbye has the quality of something that honors what it meant. The avoidance system does not easily produce that kind of closure. What it tends to produce instead is ambiguity, a trailing off rather than a definitive ending, a gradual reduction of contact rather than a clear conclusion, a quality of unfinishedness that can persist long after the practical reality of the connection has changed. That unfinished quality is uncomfortable. It does not satisfy the part of you that wants acknowledgement of what happened. That wants the investment to be seen and the cost to be recognized and the love to be honored with some form of final, explicit understanding. That part of you will not be fully satisfied by the ending of patience. It may never be fully satisfied by anything the avoidant is capable of providing, because the capacity to honor a connection with the full explicit acknowledgement it deserves requires a level of emotional availability that the avoidance system is precisely what prevents. The closure, therefore, has to come from you, not from the conversation you are waiting to have, not from the acknowledgement you are waiting for them to provide, from you. From your own honest, complete, fully felt accounting of what happened and what it cost and what it meant and what you are taking from it. From your own recognition that the love was real, the investment was genuine, the potential was not imaginary, and the limitation was also real and also final, and also not something that your continued patience was ever going to resolve. That internal closure, built by you for you, from the honest materials of your own experience, is more complete than anything the avoidant could provide even in the most available version of themselves. Because it does not depend on their capacity. It depends on yours. And your capacity, as has been demonstrated repeatedly throughout this conversation and throughout the entire arc of what you have been living, is extraordinary. Your capacity to feel fully, to examine honestly, to grieve what deserves grieving, and release what needs releasing, and carry forward only what is genuinely yours to carry, that capacity has been present throughout. It was just pointed at the wrong project. The project of understanding them, of being patient with them, of creating the conditions for their growth. All of that capacity redirected toward yourself, toward your own understanding, your own growth, your own careful and compassionate tending of the person who has been absorbing the cost of this, produces something different. Something that belongs to you rather than to the dynamic. Something that persists after the dynamic ends rather than depending on the dynamic's continuation to justify itself. The patience being a scam is not an indictment of you for practicing it. It is a structural observation about how the dynamic functions. The patience was offered from love, from genuine compassion, from the beautiful and real belief that people can grow and change, and that love, expressed with consistency and care, is a force that moves things. All of that is true in the right conditions. The conditions of the avoidant dynamic are specifically structurally the wrong ones for that truth to apply, not because the avoidant is beyond change, but because your patience is not the mechanism of their change. You are not the catalyst. You cannot be. The catalyst has to come from inside their own life in a form that is entirely independent of your management of your own availability. Knowing that, really knowing it, in the body rather than just the mind, changes the relationship to the patience itself. It stops feeling like something you are doing for the relationship and starts feeling like something you are doing instead of your own life. Instead of the fuller, more inhabited, more genuinely alive version of your days that the waiting has been deferring, the patience stops feeling like love and starts feeling like what it actually is at this stage. The continuation of a habit whose original justification has been examined and found insufficient. Insufficient, that word is worth sitting with. Not cruel, not a verdict of failure, just the honest assessment of something that does not meet the standard it was held to. The patience was held to the standard of being productive, of producing something it was told it would produce, of being the mechanism of change it was promised it would be. And measured against that standard, honestly without softening with the full clarity of everything examined here, it has been insufficient. It has produced the continuation of your presence and the continuation of the dynamic and the continuation of the cost. It has not produced the change, it has not moved the wall, it has not made the fear smaller or the capacity larger, or the pattern any less reliably itself. That is not your failure. That is the honest assessment of a strategy that was applied with genuine commitment to a situation in which it was structurally unable to produce the intended result. You did not fail at patience. Patience failed at the thing it was supposed to accomplish. And the appropriate response to a strategy that has failed is not more of the strategy. It is the honest acknowledgement of the failure, followed by the genuine, grounded, self-respecting reclamation of the resources that were being given to it. Your time, your emotional energy, your consistent, extraordinary, genuinely rare capacity for sustained, compassionate, fully invested presence. Those resources were given to the patients, and the patients could not use them to produce what you needed, which means they are available now for something else, something that can use them, something that returns what they deserve in return, something that is not a scam, something real, something that has been waiting with a patience that never needed to be justified, never needed to prove itself, never needed to defer its own needs in order to maintain the connection, for you to finally completely redirect yourself toward it. Yourself, your actual life, the one that starts now. There is a version of you that existed before the waiting became the dominant feature of your relational life. Before the patience became the posture, before the hope of someone else's eventual availability became the organizing principle around which so much of your interior was arranged. That version did not disappear. It did not get replaced or overwritten or permanently altered by the dynamic. It went quiet. It stepped back. It learned, gradually and without announcement, that there was not much space for it inside the dynamic's requirements, that the full, unedited, naturally sized version of itself was somewhat inconvenient for a relationship that needed you calibrated rather than alive. But it is still there, and the end of the patience, the genuine, chosen, fully conscious end of the waiting posture, is not just the closing of something, it is the reopening of something else, the return of the space that the hoping occupied. The gradual, sometimes disorienting, ultimately extraordinary process of rediscovering what you actually want when what you want is no longer organized around the question of when they will become available to provide it. That process deserves attention. Real attention. Not as a transitional period between this relationship and the next one, as its own destination, as the actual, primary, most important work of this particular chapter of your life. Rediscovering what you want sounds simple. It is not. Because wanting, genuine, self-sourced, unfiltered wanting that is not shaped by the constraints of someone else's capacity, requires a quality of inner freedom that has been progressively constrained over the course of the dynamic. The wanting got edited, not all at once, incrementally. Each time a want produced the wrong response. The distance, the cooling, the subtle reframe that positioned the wanting as too much, the wanting learned to make itself smaller, to present in a more acceptable form, to disguise itself as something less threatening, to defer. The deferring became habitual, and habits, even when the conditions that produced them have changed, continue to run. So even now, even in the absence of the specific person whose response trained the editing, the wants may arrive already modified, already pre-apologized for, already smaller than their actual size. And you may not immediately notice the modification, because the modified version has become so familiar that it reads as your actual desire rather than the managed version of it. Part of the work is learning to notice the modification, to catch the want before it edits itself, and ask, what is this actually? Before the apology. What do I actually want? Before the assessment of whether it is too much, What would I ask for, reach for, move toward, if there were no one whose comfort required me to be smaller than I am? Those questions do not have immediate answers for most people in this position. The answers have to be excavated, slowly, through a process that involves more patience. But patience of an entirely different kind than the kind that has been exhausted here. Not patience with someone else's process. Patience with your own. With the time it takes for the edited version to reveal what it has been editing. With the gradual, sometimes surprising emergence of desires and preferences and directions that were present all along but had insufficient space to be heard above the noise of the dynamic. Some of what emerges will be expected. The obvious things that were put on hold while the relationship occupied the foreground of your attention. The projects deferred. The friendships that received less than they deserved. The parts of your professional or creative or physical life that were maintained at a minimum while so much of your energy went elsewhere. Those things are relatively easy to identify and relatively straightforward to reinvest in. They were waiting in a place you knew about. You just couldn't fully get to them. But some of what emerges will be unexpected. Surprising in the way that genuine self-discovery is always somewhat surprising, because the self you are discovering is not the self you constructed in relation to the dynamic, but the self that exists prior to and beneath any particular relational context. The self that has preferences you forgot about, directions it was moving in before the relationship redirected so much of its momentum, questions it was asking before the primary question became when will they be available, and what do I do in the meantime? Those prior questions are worth finding again, not because they are more important than questions about love and connection. They are not. Love and connection are among the most important things in a human life, but because they are yours in a way that the questions generated by the dynamic were not entirely yours. The dynamic's questions required the dynamic to exist in order to be relevant. Your prior questions, the ones about who you are and what you want and where you are going and what kind of life you are building, those questions persist regardless of any particular relationship. They are the through line, the constant, the questions that will still be asking themselves when this particular chapter has fully resolved and the next one is underway. Returning to those questions is not a retreat from relationship. It is the construction of the self that will eventually enter the next relationship as a genuinely complete participant rather than a participant who is still organized around the absence of what the last relationship couldn't provide. Because that is the alternative, entering the next significant connection while still carrying the posture of the patient waiter, still organized around the hope of eventual availability, still calibrated to the requirements of a dynamic that no longer exists, but whose habits persist. The habits persist until something replaces them. And what replaces them is not willpower or the intellectual commitment to doing things differently. What replaces them is the genuine inhabitation of a different experience, the actual daily lived experience of being primarily oriented towards your own life, of your wants arriving unedited, of your needs being met, sometimes by others, sometimes by yourself, always by something that is actually present rather than perpetually almost available. That experience begins in small ways, so small they can seem unrelated to the larger work of recovery from the dynamic. The morning you wake up and your first thought is something genuinely yours, rather than the habitual monitoring of where things stand. The afternoon you spend entirely absorbed in something that matters to you, without the background hum of the hoping running underneath everything. The conversation with a friend where you are fully present because you are not managing an interior landscape organized around someone else's availability. The moment you notice that your own company is not just tolerable, but actually good. That the quiet is not empty, but inhabited. That you are there, actually there, in your own life, in the present, fully. These moments accumulate. They do not announce themselves as milestones. They are not dramatic. They are the texture of a life being genuinely lived rather than suspended. And they build something. Not all at once, not according to any visible schedule, but steadily, that is more durable than anything the patient was trying to build inside the dynamic. They build the actual foundation, the one that belongs to you, the one that does not shift when someone else withdraws or return when someone else reaches. The one that is simply, reliably, permanently there because you built it from the materials of your own experience, rather than from the hope of someone else's eventual presence. On that foundation, love, when it comes in its genuine form from a genuinely available person, lands differently, not with the urgency of something that has been waited for too long, not with the relieved, slightly desperate quality of scarcity finally resolved, with the recognition of something that fits. Something that does not require translation or management or the suspension of your own knowing in service of a hope. Something that meets you at your actual size, rather than requiring you to be smaller. That meeting of two people who are each genuinely present, each genuinely invested, each bringing their full self rather than the managed version, is what love is supposed to feel like when it is functioning as it is supposed to function. Not perfect. Not without difficulty or misunderstanding or the ordinary friction of two complex people building something together, but equitable, reciprocal, genuinely mutual in a way that the patient waiting was always hoping to produce and structurally could not. You will recognize it not because it matches a template, because it does not produce the familiar anxiety, because the silence is comfortable rather than charged with significance, because the warmth is consistent rather than rationed, because your needs do not feel like a problem requiring management, but like the ordinary content of a relationship between two people who have chosen each other with full awareness of what the choosing requires. The choosing, that is the thing the patient's narrative obscured for so long. The idea that love is something that happens to you, that the right conditions, maintained with sufficient patience, will eventually produce the experience of being fully chosen, that the waiting is the path to the choosing. That if you create enough safety and demonstrate enough consistency and absorb enough distance, the choosing will eventually occur. It will not. Not through that mechanism. The choosing, the genuine, full, unambiguous, behaviorally demonstrated choosing of another person, is not something that patience produces in someone who is not yet ready to choose. It is something that occurs when two people who have each done sufficient internal work arrive at a connection that is mutually recognized as significant and mutually honored through consistent, reciprocal, genuinely present investment. You cannot wait someone into that readiness. You can only arrive at your own. And your own readiness, which is what the entire arc of this conversation has been building toward, from the first moment of honest clarity, through every layer of understanding and self-examination and ground building, your own readiness is not conditional on theirs. It is happening, right now, in the choosing of clarity over comfort, in the honest acknowledgement that the patience was not working, in the reclamation of your own agency, in the return to the prior questions, in the rediscovery of your own unedited wanting, in the decision, quiet, permanent, made from genuine strength rather than resigned defeat, that your life is not a waiting room. It never was. That was always the misunderstanding at the center of the patience. That your life, the actual finite, irreplaceable, genuinely extraordinary life that is yours, and only yours, was something to be put on hold while someone else's readiness caught up to your investment. That the fullness of your own living was something to be rationed and managed and partially deferred in service of maintaining a connection that could not yet honor what you were giving it. Your life is not a waiting room, it is the destination, it is the point. It is the thing itself, not the preamble to something else, not the interim period before the relationship becomes what it needs to become, not the background against which the real story is taking place. It is the real story. The only one, the one being written right now in how you spend this day and the next, and the one after that. And the patience, the specific, costly, structurally counterproductive patience that this entire video has been examining. The patience is over. Not because you are giving up, because you are showing up. For yourself. For the life that has been waiting not with the anxious, contingent, hope-dependent waiting of the dynamic, but with the steady, unconditional, always available presence of something that belongs entirely to you. You do not need to wait for it. You are already inside it. The only question that remains is whether you are going to fully arrive. The answer, built from everything examined here, from every layer of clarity and self-knowledge and genuine grounded hard-won understanding, is yes. Finally, completely, with your whole self.